So that brings us to the last thing, the total integrated nutrient cycling system. This is really the reasoning behind permaponics. When we bring back the soil, the reason is to get nutrients to our food. We want to eat nutritious food. We want our food to have the correct nutrient sources. And this is how we assure that those nutrients are in the soil. So we have 7 components of the tinks at Raktamachat. So aquaculture, where we have fish or the nutrient cycling derived in a pond. We have vermiculture, our worm farm. We have hydroponics, the utilization of water. Compost, in this instance, thermal composting. Compost teas, biofertilizers utilized to create anaerobic composting, as opposed to the thermal composting or aerobic composting of item 4, and biochars. So what's aquaculture? Well, aquaculture is the farming of aquatic organisms such as fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and aquatic plants. Aquaculture involves cultivating freshwater and saltwater populations under controlled conditions, which can be contrasted with commercial fishing, which is harvesting of wild fish. So here we have a hapa cage. So in our ponds are quite small in the aspect. We don't have a cage. You can consider our pond as the cage. We don't use cage agriculture. And we have natural fish that are fed through natural aquatic situations, and we utilize that water in our permaponics system. So a pond begins with mostly water. So if we start a new system, so this is pictures of us at Raktamachat when we dug one of our small ponds that we use. And it has very few nutrients and very little aquatic life. So over time, the pond can accumulate nutrients. That's the cycle. So as we introduce fish, the fish are fed some food source. They make a manure or nitrites. The nitrogen denitrification bacteria start to proliferate in the pond. They create what's called phyto and photoplankton blooms, meaning that microorganisms, algae, will live in the pond. And sometimes you can see pond water is kind of green. The greenish nature of the pond water is actually the living organisms you're seeing. Then they're harvesting in the top layer of pond photosynthesis. So the photosynthesis is coming in, they're utilizing that and they're living. And fish, typically herbivores, most fish are herbivores, they swim around and they basically just filter feed like a whale. Filter feed these phyto and photoplankton, and then you have predators. The predator fish will prey on the herbaceous fish. So we want to try to kickstart or jumpstart that. So one of the ways that you can do that is called greening a pond. In order to green a pond, you don't really have enough fish in it yet. So what you do is you take any type of manure, whether it's chicken, cows, pigs, whatever, even people. And if you put enough of that and you go around the edges and you just throw manure in the pond, okay? That's called greening a pond. What will happen is you increase the ability for the nitrogen denitrification bacteria to proliferate, creating the phyto and photoplankton bloom. So it's just like we feed compost tea. You want to add sugar to make effective microorganisms. Well, if I add manure, I make our phyto and photoplankton. They bloom, and then the color of the pond changes from this brown, as we see, looks like chocolate milk, to the more green-ish color that we see in a naturalized pond. So that's a way to kickstart your ponds. So another aspect of aquaculture, the organisms in the pond, they live, they grow, they die. It's kind of a closed system. Their remains decay in the pond, and their nutrients that grow them are released back into the pond water over time, and they keep cycling. So as a pond's longer, it gets more dynamic. There's more nutrient cycling going over the length of the pond. So that's one of the things we take into question. In aquaculture, there's 4 basic elements that are required in abundance to make aquatic organisms. They're carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. The 3 minerals that are vital to growth of all plants are oxygen. Oxygen is also required in the root zone of plants, so the aerobic bacteria will flourish. So here we see the molecular structure of those minerals. So vermiculture. Worm castings are rich in water-soluble plant nutrients and contain 50% more humus than what was normally found in topsoil. So you can think about it as being densified. You take manure, and the worms are densifying the manure into a smaller, more dense process. And that's why you would see that water-soluble plant nutrient being dense 50%. So when we, as our worm farms, we take manures from our animal systems via goats, chickens, or cows, and we feed to our worms. They're densifying that nutrient. So we're getting this little packet of nutrient. Think about, there's that brand of stuff called Miracle Grow. You know, just put this water, spray it on my plant, and it grows. Well, that's water-soluble nutrients, but in a non-organic manner, a synthetic manner. Worm castings is basically the organic equivalent of Miracle Grow. If you use them, your plants really are going to respond. So that's what we're trying to do. So worm castings are packed with minerals that are essential for your plant growth. And as a permaculturist or even a permaponics enthusiast, having a worm farm is going to help you to provide the nutrition to your plants in an economical manner. So vermiculture, what is it made up of? Worm castings are rich in water-soluble plant nutrients such as nitrites, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, and calcium. Worm castings have also been shown in laboratory tests to contain reduced levels of contaminants and higher saturation of nutrients than do organic materials before vermicomposting. What does that mean again? They densify the material. So if you take in cow manure, the worm eats it and densifies it into a more nutrient-dense package, okay? So that's what's going on there. And hydroculture, let's look at that. All nutrients in the system are provided by a hydroponics flow-through system and are water-soluble. They are therefore readily accessible to the plants and can be assimilated by the plants. So what happens here? We use hydroponics, or the concept of hydroculture, working water. We use water in our system, we make it work, hydroculture, coming from our systems. So at this point, very similar that you would find in others, and Permaponics also utilizes that. But where it differs again, we have soil. So then we have to feed our soil, same as we do in permaculture. So we create compost. This is a thermal compost, aerobic thermal composting. So compost provides carbon and nitrogen to your soil, and it will be teeming with microorganisms that will continue to enhance and digest your current soil. If you use rock powders in your compost, there's no limit to the number of minerals available to your plants. But be very careful, guys. If we put rock powders, we typically are going to affect the pH, and over a long period of time to break down. Because in our compost, it is aerobic. And so rock powders don't break down in aerobic conditions very well. The beautiful thing is about why we're saying you could add rock powder to your compost in a permaponics, because permaponics has an anaerobic condition. When we set the wick in the growing bed, that point is anaerobic. So as the compost interacts with the anaerobic condition, the anaerobic bacteria can break down and consume the compost. And it happens really fast because there's such an anaerobic condition of surface area. So that's why at the end of each of our growing cycles, we add more compost. The compost is being consumed and fed to the plant by the both aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. But if it's in just a compost pile, just a standardized compost pile, if you add in rock dust, you don't get as much conversion to minerals as you would in an anaerobic condition. And that's why we would show that we would put a anaerobic, or what we call biofertilization. Our bioferts are anaerobic, in which we add rock dust, okay, in a purely permaculture situation. But in our permaponics, because we've kind of combined both, we have both the anaerobic and aerobic condition separated by the wicking layer. Then you can add rock dust to your compost to put into your permaponics. But it might not be as beneficial if you were doing that in a more gardening situation. And compost tea. Compost tea increases the number of microorganisms in your system and concentrates nitrogen into the system, which comes from the bodies of the microorganisms themselves when they die off and are broken down naturally by other decomposers. So in this instance, a little bit of misnomer, people doing compost tea, it's been popularized by people such as Dr. Elaine Ingram and the Soil Food Web, but they don't really like to tell you that, well, actually what you're doing is growing all of these microorganisms, and when you put them in your garden, they die. That's maybe not politically correct or something, but that's basically what's happening. The microorganisms, they're part of a kingdom, and they're going to get the free water-soluble sugars, and they love the sugars, and they're going to grow, and they're going to multiply, do their thing, and they're going to be said to bloom. But when they bloom and they've eaten all of the water-soluble sugars, they still want to live. So most of them don't want to die. So when I put them in the garden, some of them will be able to survive and eat my compost. For instance, I'm spraying them over the compost, and I'm saying, eat that compost quickly and convert that to food for my plant. But the vast majority, when you do this type of bloom, are going to die. They're not going to be able to be taken from this water-soluble solution, sprayed over the garden, and live. And when they die, they're water-soluble. So the plants can take them up very readily. So this is where we see this bloom, especially if you're to spray onto your plant, which we call foliar feeding. So we can take our compost tea and spray it directly onto the plant's leaves. And plants, most people wouldn't see, but plants can take in nutrients externally. So they can take in proteins, amino acids, nitrogen externally. So when we spray the compost tea onto the plant's leaves, it actually is feeding externally through what's called foliar feeding. And bioferts. We can make our own bioferts, which we do here at Raktamachat. So biofertilizer is an anaerobic composting system. Microorganisms lock the nutrients in a liquid form so they can be added to the soil. Rock dust can be added to this process to alleviate more nutrients or minerals. And as I said, the microorganisms that proliferate in anaerobic conditions could be described as all teeth. They're really, really aggressive. So aggressive that they can eat and consume rock dust. But aerobic microorganisms are not that aggressive, and they don't tend to do that. And that's why we find we utilize rock dust in our aerobic garden to balance pH, right? So that adjusts our pH. But we utilize, when we put the same rock dust into our anaerobic, it doesn't change the pH, right? Because the microorganisms consume it. And then we're able to get what's described as water-soluble minerals. So we want to have those water-soluble minerals utilizing anaerobic conditions. And another advantage to biofertilization is that the process of making it will kill off any parasites or seeds. So sometimes we may have things that we're really concerned that if I compost this and I don't compost it perfectly, then I go to put it in my garden and it grows lots of weeds. Like for instance, if I use cow manure and the cow obviously eating grasses with lots of seeds and I don't compost it perfectly, and I go to put my compost in my garden and I start growing weeds all in my garden, right? That's no good. But if I took that same manure, for instance, or if I cut my grass and I had cut grass, but there was grass seeds in my grass, right? I could put that into an anaerobic fermentation and that would kill the seeds. Also, it would kill any parasites, bugs, or diseases that were in there. Each kingdom cannot survive in another kingdom. So this kingdom goes in, and when it comes out, it's a phase changed. It's changed its nature. So that's where we can use that to stop any pathogen transfer from one kingdom to the second kingdom. And biochar. Biochar is applied to improve the physical, chemical, and biological properties of our growing medium. What it's going to do is it's going to improve the surface area of your soils. It's going to give you a very high surface area tied to the molecular structure of the carbon atom. And at this point, what that does is the effective microorganisms have more place to live. So they see the char kind of as a house. So they attach themselves all over the char. Char is also interesting because with a high surface area, you get water. So more water will attach to the char. So if you have soils that are too, like here at Raktamachat, we have high clay soils. So our soils can become, one, compacted if there's no water, very hard like concrete. And when there's lots of water, they turn into like, they flood. They hold water too well. So they're either compacted or too well are flooded. So if we add to those types of soils an alleviation of biochar, then that will allow that to become more well drained. It won't tend to flood as much. But what's interesting is if we take the same char and we add it to sand, it will allow the sand to hold more water. So soil or biochar can be seen as balancing the water table. It's not too well drained and it's not too, flooding. So either problem you have, whether you have too much clays or too many sands, by adding biochar, you alleviate both problems. You increase the surface area, and that's the main two benefits that allow the soil food web to improve. So here you can see simplistically making biochar and garden experiments that people do on the internet with the addition of only biochar, nothing else changes. And mostly what's happening there is the water retention and the microbial population is increased. Therefore, you get an increase in your plant production without the need for more fertilization. So that's what we have. I hope that that's a great introduction to Permaponics. And with the Permaponics course videos, things that'll be coming out that people can see more in-depthly each of these items, how they're working, what's going on with them. But hopefully that gives you the enthusiast why Permaponics may work, what's going on. And then when you see the systems in action through practical videos, then you would be able to really get an idea of how you could build one your own.